Good evening. A special thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Walpa for sponsoring tonight's class in honor of the Rabbi and Rebbitzin. So thank you very much. Topic is OCD, anxiety, and Halacha. This is part one of a discussion that will probably take us a couple of weeks. This is a topic that I think hits home for many of us. It is a very common struggle that many, millions and millions of human beings have, just getting through life, trying to face the challenges of insecurity, of anxiety, of OCD on different levels. And the goal of tonight's discussion is really just to have a general outlook, to try to explore together the basic approach towards life that I think as a foundation can be very helpful when either we personally deal with issues of anxiety or OCD, and it can be very helpful when trying to help others, children, friends, or a spouse. Now, as you know, I am Rabbi Doctor, PhD, right? So I don't have a PhD. And the goal of our discussions is not to delve into the clinical aspects of all of the latest research, and that is not my area of expertise, but rather our pursuit is going to try to understand and incorporate the basic hashkafas haTorah. What is the Torah outlook generally on what we're striving for, our attitudes, our feelings towards life in general, and then to explore some of the great teachings of the Stipler and other contemporary poskim relating to both hashkafically and halachically the struggle of anxiety and OCD within our daily lives. The Sharei Tshuva, the Rebbeinu Yonah writes, quoting the verse in Mishlei, Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid. Fortunate is the person who is always afraid. It's a wonderful thing to be Mefachei Tamid. And he explains, in the context of tshuva, of trying to come closer to Hashem, Afal Pishahu Moda V'Ozev, even if I've left behind some of my negative ways, Yesh Alav Lefachei Tamid, Shlomo HaMelech is telling us it's still appropriate to have an ongoing pachad, which is usually translated as fear. What is that fear of? Ulai lo hishlim chok hatshuva. Perhaps even though I've transformed myself, I've done tshuva, but maybe there's still more to go. I haven't really done everything I can do, and therefore it's appropriate to be mefachei tamid. So how does that make you feel? Is that empowering? Does it make you feel more calm and serene? Am I striving to be mefachei tamid? Is that something that sounds appealing? Right, so obviously most of us would say, not really. I'd rather not be constantly afraid, and is that really the ideal? Is that really what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be feeling? And clearly the answer is no. The goal is not to be afraid. The goal is not to be anxious. And we all know that whatever level of pain one goes through, physically or externally, the pain that we suffer in the internal realm can be so much more dreadful. Dealing with issues of insecurity and anxiety, although I can't point to one place in my body that's aching, but that inner pain can be paralyzing. Shlomo HaMelech writes in Mishlei elsewhere, Leiv sameach yetiv panim, that the heart that's besimcha, that's feeling joy, it brings gladness to the face. Uba'atzvus leiv ruach necheya. However, if the heart is feeling down and dejected and depressed, so then my whole physical body just withers. Explains the Rebbeinu Yonah that Shlomo HaMelech is telling us, Ki ikar hanos haguf v'tzauro, the main pleasure or pain that we could experience, the main physical pleasure or pain, taluyim b'leiv. It's dependent on what's happening in my heart and in my mind. Ki misimchas alev yagia ikar tanug haguf. When I'm feeling content and I'm feeling grateful and I have an appreciation for life and I'm not being held down by fears and anxiety, not only do I have a hargasha, this internal feeling, but it has an impact on my overall body, my functioning. And the opposite's also true. Uba'atzvos libo yagia shever ruach. If internally I'm broken and I'm feeling down and dejected and inferior, so then physically I'll have pains as well. But everything is based on what's going on within my mind and within my heart. So Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid, why in the world would Shlomo HaMelech tell us it's a good state of mind to be constantly afraid? Clearly he doesn't mean we should be afraid in an unhealthy way, but what does he mean? There's I think the modern term is a person who's relaxed, so he's chilled out. That's probably no longer modern. That's already probably 15 years old by now. What's the more modern or contemporary way of saying chilled out? I don't know. He's so sick. So sick. It's also like 20. It's a... Where does this idea come from? Being chilled out? And is this a Torah value? Is it something that we're actually striving for? Superficially, we would probably assume, no, if a person takes life seriously, and every moment is meaningful and you have to capitalize on every opportunity, how can you live in a chilled out state? The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, Schok v'kalis rosh margilin le'erva. Schok, laughter, kalis rosh is lightheadedness. That could lead to immoral behavior. Now, the rest of the Mishnah, it's interesting, has a very different flow to it. Right? This is very negative. If you have too much schok and kalis rosh, that will lead you to immoral behavior. The continuation of the Mishnah, though, is more in the positive. For example, siag l'Torah maisros. Masoros, rather, siag l'Torah. Right? Being part of the legacy, part of the tradition, is a siag l'Torah. It's a fence. It's a way of keeping and maintaining your Torah. Maisros siag l'osher. One who gives meiser, one who makes sure to give tzedakah, that's a way of maintaining one's wealth. So the rest of the Mishnah is giving us instructions. If you want to keep something precious, here's what you should do. It's the first part of the Mishnah that has it in the negative. If you do schok v'kalis rosh, if you're acting in a way that you're not taking things seriously, that will lead to immorality. Why not say it as follows? Atzvus v'kovid harosh, right? A certain level of depression, and kovid harosh, which means intensity, that will lead to kedusha. That will lead to positive behavior. And that would be much more in line with the rest of the Mishnah. So the Tiferes Yisrael says something so incredibly fundamental. He explains that obviously atzvus, being in this state of depression, is not the ideal. Ve'ein hashchina shoreim ha'otzev. We don't have that divine presence with us when we're in a state of feeling down. But then he says something surprising. V'koved rosh, and even the state of mind of koved rosh, which means there's an intensity, nami rak b'shas hatfila yafa. That's only appropriate when you're davening. Right? We know that tefillah is meditation, and that requires a focus and intensity of thought. a rikuz machshava, right? You're gathering all of your mental and emotional capacities. But that's only during davening. However, concludes the Tiferes Yisrael, V'shneihem menios gedolos ba'avodos Hashem. But both of these midos, namely atzvos, being depressed, and koved harosh, being intense, can actually be a blockage in one's service of God. So I get being depressed is probably not going to propel you forward. But how can he say that koved harosh is also something that, if taken outside the context of davening, that's also a mania, that's a blockage of our spirituality? If anything, I would assume the exact opposite. The more intense you are, the more you're capitalizing on every moment, and the more you're able to grow and to become more spiritual. Why is koved harosh also a mania? Why is intensity also a blockage to real wholesome growth? What would you say? The answer is, if you're overly tense for too much of your day, for too many of your interactions, what that does is it suffocates you. And it almost zaps the chiyus, the life, out of your neshama. Living in an ongoing state of koved rosh is very unhealthy. And when you see people who are getting more inspired, or a young man starting off his yeshiva career, and there's an overexpression of intensity, oftentimes that's not something to be excited about, but rather it's something to be nervous about. Because too much of that koved rosh, too often, is a very unhealthy thing. It's a mania, it's a blockage between you and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what then is the ideal state? Concludes the Tiferes Yisrael on his commentary to this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. He says there are two qualities we're striving for to have these feelings within us as much as possible. Number one is simcha. Now, simcha doesn't mean you have to be walking around with a smile, right? Always jolly. There's no mitzvah to be jolly. Those who have that personality, God bless them, and I'm jealous. But simcha in this context means I'm able to feel content. There's a sense of gratitude and appreciation for life. There's a sipuk hanefesh, there's a satisfaction. Simcha, and the other quality, says Tiferes Yisrael, is kalus haguf. Literally, kalus haguf means lightness of the body. So schok v'kalus rosh, too much of that could be dangerous. But simcha v'kalus haguf, that's the ideal state. That's the ideal state. How do we define kalus haguf, lightness of the body? Or you might say, somewhat chilled out, relaxed. So how in the world does this description of the ideal state of mind fit with the advice of Shlomo HaMelech? Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid, you should always be afraid. If I'm always afraid, doesn't that also have the connotation of koved harosh, of intensity? How do we fit these two ideas together? I'll share with you a conversation I actually had just a couple days ago. Very impressive, very sincere young lady who came back from seminary. She's probably 19. She was asking a couple of questions, and one question I felt was very, very thoughtful. She said she came back from seminary, and she was very inspired. And then she was home for a while, and then went back to Israel for a week. And during that week, she spent time with some of her teachers, and she had that injection of chizuk again. So now she's back in America, and she was asking, is it appropriate to daven Maariv every night? Right? Officially, women don't have the obligation to daven Maariv, but she was asking. I did so in Eretz Yisrael. It was very meaningful. Part of me wants to continue this practice. On the other hand, I'm a little bit nervous because it's quite a commitment. So I asked the question, is davening Mariv something that you enjoy and look forward to? And the response was, well, to be brutally honest, not really. I'm doing it because I'm trying to show my commitment and take steps forward in my avodas Hashem. So by accepting upon myself to daven Mariv every night, I'm doing that. Do you have a level of anxiety throughout the day knowing that you have this burden that you have to daven Mariv before you go to sleep? Yeah, it is somewhat of a burden because I take it seriously. If I commit to something, I take it seriously. So I asked her, do you think it's really the best thing then for your overall avodas Hashem? Obviously, you want to be taking steps forward, but one major component that is so foundational is the concept of Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. We have to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with joy. And if I'm taking on more obligations that I don't really have to be doing, that might chip away at my Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. So it's a wonderful hargasha, it's a very noble thought, but it might not be the best thing for you. My personal advice was, you just got back from this week, you're on a high, don't commit to anything right now, give yourself some time, and maybe in the meantime, you could do something else. You could say a few paragraphs of Tehillim every day. Nothing set, right? Nothing set necessarily that could bring on that same burden, but to be very weary, to be very careful, even when we're trying to grow and to expand our horizons, to do so in a way where it's not taking away from my feelings of simcha sachayim, that sense of being content, of being satisfied, of kalus haguf. Now, this idea comes from Rav Wolbe. Rav Wolbe in the Alei Shor, this is the top of page 2. He speaks about some of the complexities that we encounter when trying to really improve and take steps forward. He says, "Harei b'chol chumra she'anu machmirim al atzmeinu." Every time we're thinking of doing something more, something additional. U'b'chol hosafa ba'avodas Hashem, any addition in my avodas Hashem, there's always a concern of olul koach hamarida lisorer ulahamrid osanu neged kol avodas Hashem. I could awaken within myself a feeling of rebellion, which is a strange thing. Why am I taking on more? Because I so much want to come closer to you, Hashem. But I have to be careful, because if I take on too much too quickly, and I'm almost stifling myself, or I'm placing more obligations on myself at this point than I'm ready for, what I'm really doing is I'm stoking the coals of a rebellion within. If a person does more than he or she can do, so in the long run I'm going to be losing out. And he explains, he says, sometimes yikarim she'eschilu lavod al atzmam. You have precious young men, young women who really start taking life and Yiddishkeit seriously, but they do so bli hadracha, without the guidance, without someone older and wiser leading them, velo hetzlichu. And then what happens is inevitably they're not going to be successful oftentimes. O shehavoda hechbida aleim yoser midai, or they take too much on to the point where their whole spiritual experience becomes negative. So I shared with her, I said, I think if you don't really enjoy doing this every night, and you were to have this ongoing commitment, it might be yatsa scharo behefseda, you might be losing more than you're gaining. What does it mean, therefore, to be mefached tamid? That seems to be flying in the face of everything that we're learning. We're not supposed to be afraid, we're not supposed to be anxious. What Shlomo HaMelech is telling us, mefached doesn't have to be a description of a feeling of fear or anxiety. Mefached can be more a description of a mindset, of being conscious, of being mindful, of being careful. Mefached tamid, I'm not scared, I'm not afraid, but I'm concerned. I want to make sure that what I'm doing is the right thing. And therefore, I'll ask a question, I'll probe deeper, I'll explore more within myself. Mefached does not mean that we should be afraid or anxious. It means we should be conscious of what we're doing and careful in how we're doing it. But the feelings that we're striving for within, simcha v'kalas haguf. There's a famous analogy from the Duvna Magid where he speaks about all the analogies in the olden days had to do either with a king and his son or a guy in a train, right? Those are the two basic analogies we have. So the Duvna Magid has an analogy with the guy coming off a train, and he has one of his bags, but it looks like he forgot the other one behind him. So when he realizes that he forgot his other bag, he turns around, and he sees the porter, right, the guy that works in the train. He's running towards him saying, "Sir, I think I have your bag." And he's schlepping this really heavy suitcase. The guy says, I don't think that's mine. No, I saw when you came on, you had the black attaché. This is your bag. How do you know it's not? Well, my bag wasn't that heavy. You wouldn't have to be schlepping it like that. My bag was very light. You could easily just pick it up and carry it to me. The fact that you're schlepping and being matriach yourself to get that heavy bag to me, I know that's not my bag. Explains the Duvna Magid, when Hashem sees us engaged in Torah and mitzvos and trying to really live that lifestyle of frumkeit, if the way we're viewing it is, it's a burden and it's a source of anxiety, and it's so hard to be a yid, and it's so difficult to do all the obligations and responsibilities we have, Hashem says, whoa, that's not my bag. That's your baggage. My bag, darchecha darchei noam, v'chol nesivoseha shalom. My Torah is pleasant. It's supposed to enhance your simcha and kalas haguf. If it's bringing Kovid harosh too often, it's bringing atzvos, it's bringing a sense of anxiety or animosity. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, those are not my mitzvos. That's not my Torah. The book, Spare the Child, he relates that, this is Rabbi Yechiel Jacobson, who was a real expert in chinuch and in education. He says that he's come across something over the last few decades that he finds very disturbing. He's referring to a bizarre perception which associates yiras shamayim with gloom. So generally speaking, how do we translate yiras shamayim? Fear of heaven. I actually looked for this in my kids' room. There's a particular, it's a children's book, and it goes through different midos. And I remember being very turned off by the picture it had for the midah of yiras shamayim. What was the picture? It was basically like a little boy, kind of meek and timid. Right? That's not the picture of yiras shamayim you want to paint for children or for yourselves. And this is exactly what Rabbi Jacobson is talking about, that there's this warped perception that yiras shamayim equals gloom. It is as though a person's yiras shamayim depends on how dejected he looks. And that's why we have this very sad reality. And now it's a little bit different, Baruch Hashem. But going back not that many years ago, it was hard to find a picture of a gadol when he was smiling. Because the perception was, if people are trying to buy a picture of a gadol, they want him to look chashuv. How do you look chashuv? Only if you're doing this. Right? or if you're screaming from the podium like this. To have a picture of a gadol, maybe you're Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, maybe, but it's based on this warped perception of what Yiras Shamayim is. This seems to have become something of an ideology, one which was never part of the Yiddishkeit of our forefathers or Torah leaders. There is no basis for this perception, for this picture, this very unhealthy image of Yiras Shamayim. But we cannot simply ignore this warped, counterfeit form of Yiddishkeit, not only because it is entirely at odds with true Judaism, but also because it has wreaked havoc on our chinuch. When you're trying to educate and inspire and empower students or children, if they have this feeling that the more frum I am, or the more connected I become to Torah and mitzvos, the less happy and more reserved and timid and scared I become, then I want nothing to do with that lifestyle. I want nothing to do with that reality. So where does this leave us practically? Practically speaking, I think we have a few general ideas. The first is that a sense of gratitude, joy, and fun is not at all at odds with Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid, nor is it at odds with Yiras Shamayim. Likely, those two, and we don't have time to delve into the real, deeper definition of what Yiras Shamayim actually is, but if you think about it for a moment, if Yiras Shamayim, at least in part, is living with more of an awareness, more of that presence of Hashem with me in everything that I do, that I have this very healthy yira, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here, and there's a truth to this relationship, and it's vivid and it's tangible, so then that doesn't bring gloom and despair and dejection. That helps fuel the simcha and the kalas haguf. Right? That joy and contentment and that serenity that we all want, which is the ideal, explains the Tiferes Yisrael, that is the ideal mind state. It's not a contradiction, but rather they're mechazik each other. Healthy Yiras Shamayim feeds into simcha sachayim, feeds into that joy and appreciation of life. And the joy and appreciation of life can very well feed into a healthy Yiras Shamayim. So having this as a backdrop where it's possible to fulfill the advice of Shlomo HaMelech, Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid, not to be scared and anxious, but to be conscious and aware, living with zehirus. That's Mefachei Tamid. That's a conceptual, intellectual state. The emotional world, though, is simcha v'kalas haguf. The second idea is that meaningful and intentional engagement with mitzvos is something that we can and must accomplish without koved harosh, without the intensity, the unhealthy intensity that oftentimes comes along with one who is sincere and devout. When I'm trying to be medaktik b'mitzvos, and I'm learning halacha and I want to know how to do it in the right way at the right time, not to allow the koved harosh, the intensity, the fear, the unhealthy anxiety to come in, because if that's how I'm living the halacha, and it becomes an ongoing cycle of questioning myself and never feeling confident and always having regrets and second thoughts, then Hashem says, that's not my mitzvah. That's your struggle, but that's not what the Torah is. So idea number 2 is meaningful and intentional engagement in mitzvos without intensity. To be serious, to take life seriously, but not to have that intensity. The third and final idea, based on these sources, is the importance of teaching the guiding principles of halacha, not just the do's and don'ts. And I've seen this on every level. Right? How often do we find ourselves confused about something, And all we have to work with is, I remember a couple years ago, Rabbi so-and-so said that. And that might apply in this case. But I also remember hearing a shir from Rabbi so-and-so and he was saying this. And then I looked it up in the 39 Malachos book, and he had some random example about flies in a box. I didn't get it, right? So trying to put everything together, when you have many do's and don'ts, the whole system of halacha, of how we live life, can be viewed as this arbitrary, almost scary world of not knowing where to take my next step because I might be doing something wrong. How do we counteract that? So educationally, that's why it's so crucial when we're learning halacha for ourselves and when we're teaching it to others, to try to paint the picture and give the guidelines, the klalim. These are the guiding principles of this particular area of halacha. There are obviously many details to learn in every aspect of halacha, but likely I'm not going to remember everything. But if I have a clarity on the guiding principles, what that does is it empowers me because I have an understanding of how to approach this area of life. I might not know certain things and I'll ask questions. But I think from an educational standpoint, having the context of where the halacha fits in is so crucial. What I want to do is leave this as a foundation. This is the goal we're striving for. I think we would all agree that if we could attain more simcha and kalas haguf and be serious and engaged in mitzvos without the intensity, that would be the ideal. And we'd love to get there. What we're going to do next time, in Mirz Hashem, is try to explore what exactly are the challenges of OCD and different forms of anxiety, how they're expressed within a frum lifestyle. Does a frum lifestyle add fuel to that fire? Right? If I have that tendency, does it make my life more difficult because now I care about all of these details and nuances of halacha? We'll have to explore what some of the Gedolim teach us and the guidelines that come from their Hashkafas HaTorah. Looking forward to continuing. Have a wonderful night.